The single dad, Leo Miller, didn't have a legal team or funding, yet he stood in the mahogany boardroom, looking at the four men who controlled the city's power grid, and stated plainly, "I need your company, or I'll shut down this entire district by sunrise." The air conditioning whirred silently, failing to cool the sheer disbelief radiating from the four CEOs. Arthur Vance, the oldest, merely adjusted his silk tie and laughed, a short, condescending burst of sound. "A man who fixes bicycles thinks he can dismantle a multi-billion-dollar acquisition in 72 hours. You have nothing, Miller." Leo ignored the mockery, focusing on the blinking red light on the small, battered device in his hand. The device was counting down from 030000. Leo returned to his small, two-story structure nestled behind the industrial park, half garage, half living space. The metallic scent of oil and ozone clung to the air, a familiar comfort. He moved with the focused, quiet efficiency of a man who needed minimal space to exist. The fluorescent lights flickered once before settling into a cold, humming glare that illuminated the organized chaos of tools, wires, and dismantled electronics. The work table was dominated by a complex circuit board and the small countdown device, now resting on a worn schematic that had seen too many revisions. He didn't bother turning on the small portable heater. The cold was a constant companion here, mirroring a deeper chill he rarely acknowledged. His movements were precise, stripping a length of copper wire with practiced speed. Every surface was clean, not out of meticulousness, but necessity. Clutter meant mistakes, and mistakes were expensive, not just in money, but in time he didn't have. He walked past the curtain separating the garage from the living area. The small room contained a twin bed pushed against the wall, a single chair, and a chipped mug holding instant coffee powder. On the wall above the bed, a faint discoloration marked where a picture once hung. He glanced at the spot, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly, before he moved on to the sink to wash the grease from his hands. It was the only sign of the life that was abruptly pulled out from under him 6 years ago. The silence was the loudest thing in the room, a vast echoing space where conversations used to be. He knew what the CEOs thought of him. A delusional mechanic with a grudge. They were right about the mechanic part. He was skilled, precise, capable of reverse engineering systems that cost millions. But the delusion, that was their error. He wasn't acting on a whim or a vendetta. He was acting out of necessity, a protective impulse far more primal than corporate greed. He checked the clock. 2 hours had passed since his visit to the boardroom. He had 69 hours left to complete the impossible task he had foolishly offered. He sat down, pulled the soldering iron close, and didn't look up again. The sound of a persistent, high-pitched squeak broke the hypnotic rhythm of the soldering iron. Leo didn't look up immediately. He was deep into recalibrating a sensitive voltage regulator. The squeak intensified, closer now, followed by the soft clatter of a kickstand. A moment later, Maya stood framed in the large roll-up door of the garage, shielded only by a thin layer of dust motes dancing in the afternoon light. She was not imposing, average height, slightly rounded shoulders from long hours standing, and hair pulled back in a hurried ponytail. She wore the uniform of the local diner, faded blue apron and comfortable, non-slip shoes. She looked thoroughly exhausted, but her eyes held a steady, kind light. Beside her, clutching the handlebars of a small red bicycle that clearly hadn't been used in months, was 8-year-old Chloe. "Sorry to interrupt, Leo," Maya said, her voice low and practical. "Chloe's chain slipped again, and I don't have the patience left today to deal with that sticky mess." She gestured toward the bike, which looked neglected rather than broken. Chloe didn't say anything, but her gaze was fixed intently on the complex wiring on Leo's workbench. She was a silent child, observant, Leo sighed internally, setting the iron down. His concentration was shattered, but when he looked at Maya, he saw the faint dark circles under her eyes, the reality of double shifts and single parenthood. He nodded curtly, pulling a pair of work gloves onto his hands. "Bring it over," he mumbled, already inspecting the damage. He didn't ask about the fee, nor did he offer a cheerful greeting. He simply knelt and started working, his movements quick and decisive, cleaning the grease, adjusting the tension, replacing a worn link with one he pulled from a disorganized drawer. It was routine. Maya always paid on time, and he always fixed it quickly, a small, silent economy of mutual respect. Maya leaned against the doorframe, letting the silence settle. She didn't try to make small talk or pry into his work. She just waited, offering a tired smile when Leo looked up briefly to retrieve a wrench. Chloe, meanwhile, had taken 2 steps closer, peering over the edge of the workbench, fascinated by the precise geometry of the exposed circuits. "What is that counting down, Mr. Leo?" Chloe whispered. Pointing at the blinking screen, Leo hesitated, then mumbled, "It's just a timer." He finished the chain with a satisfying click, wiped his hands, and stood up. "Ready." Maya thanked him, handing him 3 folded bills, exactly the agreed price. She didn't press for conversation, just offered a moment of quiet humanity before pulling Chloe away. Where are you watching this story unfold? Let me know in the comments. Later that week, Leo was trying to focus on a delicate soldering connection when the power flickered violently, plunging the garage into momentary darkness before the harsh fluorescent lights stuttered back on. The small voltage regulator he was working on immediately flared and died. He cursed under his breath, leaning back on his stool. The district's power infrastructure was aging, prone to these sudden, aggressive surges. He walked out to the alley, stretching his back, the tension from the last 48 sleepless hours pulling at his shoulders. He saw Maya across the street, wrestling with a stubborn bolt on her old, beat-up pickup truck. The truck was clearly failing its duty. Chloe was sitting patiently on the curb, drawing figures in the dust with a stick. Maya caught his eye and offered a shrug of exasperation. "Engine's running rough. Thought I could replace the alternator myself to save $70, but this bolt is fused." Leo looked at the truck, then back at his uselessly dark workbench. He had wasted a full day's work due to the power surge. He had 60 hours left on the timer and an uncooperative part to replace. He needed a distraction, something tangible he could fix without the pressure of corporate ruin looming over him. He walked across the cracked asphalt. He didn't ask permission. He simply crouched beside her. "You'll strip the head like that," he stated, his voice flat. He pointed at the wrench she was using. "Wrong size, and you need a penetrating oil, not brute force." Maya stepped back, surprised by his proximity but not by the criticism. "I don't have penetrating oil." Leo returned to his garage without a word and came back 2 minutes later with a can of industrial lubricant and a correct-sized socket wrench. He applied the oil, waited 30 seconds, then placed the wrench and applied steady, controlled pressure. The bolt yielded with a loud thunk. He didn't wait for thanks. He started inspecting the rest of the engine bay with the detached focus of an engineer. Maya watched him, the exhaustion momentarily forgotten. She saw the intense precision, the way his hands knew exactly what to do. "You should eat," she said quietly, after he'd tightened the new alternator into place. It wasn't an invitation, just a statement of fact about a man who looked like he hadn't slept or eaten properly in days. He stopped, straightening up. "I'm fine." "You're working on something dangerous, aren't you, Mr. Leo?" Chloe asked suddenly, standing up from the curb, her small voice cutting through the mechanical sounds. Leo looked at her, then at Maya. For the first time he felt exposed, yet oddly anchored. "Come on," Maya insisted, gesturing toward her truck. "I'm buying you diner coffee. It's either that or you collapse into a pile of wiring." Leo hesitated. The 3 hours ticking down on the timer suddenly irrelevant compared to the strange, quiet pull of this small, unearned offer of refuge. He followed them across the street. The diner was loud and smelled heavily of fried onion and bleach. Leo sat in a booth near the back, feeling overly large and out of place in his oil-stained clothes. Maya slid a chipped mug of black coffee across the worn laminate table. Chloe sat opposite him, silently watching the steam curl from his cup. Maya wasn't pushing conversation. She was merely present, sipping her lukewarm tea, sketching out next week's budget on a damp napkin. The absence of demands was what made the space feel safe. Leo looked around the room, his eyes catching on a display case near the counter. Inside, dusty trophies from high school sports sat next to faded newspaper clippings. One clipping, brittle and yellowed, showed a picture of the diner owner's son beaming with a baseball bat. The image snagged something cold and sharp in Leo's chest. He pulled his eyes away, focusing on the cheap plastic spoon in his coffee cup. But the image had already done its work. He was suddenly 10 years old again, standing alone on the curb of a suburban street in the deepening twilight. He remembered the specific smell of freshly cut grass mixing with exhaust fumes. He hadn't been picked up from baseball practice. Every other parent had arrived, their cars idling, lights cutting through the dusk. He had stood there for an hour, then 2. The coach had finally driven him home. The silence in the car, heavy with shared embarrassment. When they arrived, the house was dark. The note was taped to the microwave, brief and emotionless. We had to leave, suddenly. The keys are under the mat. We'll call. They never did call back. The memory wasn't dramatic, just numb. It wasn't hatred or despair that lingered, but the crushing, quiet realization that his own existence was negotiable, easily dismissed. He learned then that commitment was something other people received. He had to build his own fortress. That fortress was precision, isolation, and the absolute control he maintained over his tiny corner of the world. He picked up the spoon, his grip hard. He saw the faint, deep scar across his knuckles, a childhood souvenir from trying to fix a broken faucet with a rock because he was too afraid to ask for help. "That's a nice scar," Chloe commented softly, bringing him back to the diner. Leo didn't flinch. "It is," he agreed, putting the spoon down. He looked at Maya, who hadn't looked up from her napkin, respecting his silence. He felt the fortress walls briefly soften. He had 45 hours to force the most powerful men in the district to recognize a loss. He realized with sudden clarity that he was fighting not just for a business deal, but against the ghost of abandonment. The meetings became an unspoken, unplanned routine. Leo needed late-night soldering time, Maya needed to use the laundromat next door, and Chloe needed a place to wait that wasn't a cold bench. It started with Chloe waiting on the worn plastic chair in the corner of the garage, initially silent, but soon asking hesitant questions about the electronics. "How does the power know where to go?" she'd ask. Leo, focusing on a wire, would give short, technical answers. Resistance. Current flows to the path of least resistance. One evening, Maya brought a container of warm meatloaf and mashed potatoes. She simply placed it on the corner of his workbench, wrapped in foil, saying, "Dinner. Don't worry about paying me back." She didn't stay, she didn't hover. She just provided the practical kindness of sustenance. Leo didn't eat immediately. He continued working until his stomach loudly protested. He ate standing up, using a clean wrench as a makeshift spoon. The food was warm, deeply savory, and tasted nothing like his usual instant coffee and stale crackers. The proximity began to blur the hard lines of his isolation. Chloe developed a new habit, retrieving dropped tools. If Leo muttered a curse and dropped a tiny screw, Chloe, without being asked, would materialize from her corner, holding the screw out on her small, grimy palm. She was his silent assistant, her sincerity a constant background hum. He found himself adjusting his schedule. He made sure the garage was slightly warmer when they arrived. He cleared a small corner of the workbench, installing a lamp and a slightly cleaner cloth for Chloe to use for her drawing. He never explained the change. It was just done. Maya observed these shifts. She saw the way Leo's shoulders seemed less aggressively hunched when Chloe was nearby. She saw him patiently explain the difference between a diode and a resistor, his complex language simplifying automatically for the 8-year-old. One afternoon, Leo was wrestling a massive, obsolete transformer core onto a cart. It was heavy and the smooth metal kept slipping. Maya, returning from the laundromat, didn't ask if he needed help. She simply dropped her basket, gripped the opposite side, and together they maneuvered the weight. The effort required synchronicity and trust. They didn't speak a word until it was done. "Thanks," Leo grunted, wiping sweat from his brow. "You're welcome," Maya replied, catching her breath. In the span of 4 days, Leo had 32 hours left to dismantle a corporate merger. But his world had shrunk to the quiet rhythm of 2 other people depending on his space and his need for their quiet presence. He was still the man who built fortresses, but now he found he was leaving the gate unlocked. The pressure ratcheted up on the 3rd day. The countdown device showed 18, 43, 11. Leo hadn't slept in over 40 hours, relying entirely on the low, steady thrum of adrenaline. He was finalizing the core programming for the electromagnetic pulse sequence, the challenge he had thrown at the Millionaires. The margin for error was non-existent. Maya arrived that afternoon, her exhaustion amplified by her concern. She'd overheard 2 local business owners discussing Leo's meeting at the corporate headquarters, whispers of industrial sabotage and pending police action. She found him hunched over the main console, his face pale and set in a mask of intense focus. Chloe was across the room, quietly assembling a small plastic model airplane. "Leo," Maya started, her voice tight with worry. "I need you to tell me what you're doing. People are saying you threatened the city power grid." Leo didn't look up. "It's leverage. I told you. I'm fine." "Leverage for what? Are you going to jail? Chloe and we rely on you being here, fixing the bikes, just being around." Her voice held a note of accusation she hadn't intended. She realized how quickly she had allowed them to depend on his solid, if silent, presence. "You don't rely on me," Leo snapped, his nerves frayed beyond repair. He straightened up, the movement abrupt. "We have an exchange, service for payment. That's all this is." The harsh dismissal hung in the air. Maya felt the sting of his refusal to share, the sudden slamming of the door he had tentatively opened. At that moment, Chloe, trying to attach a delicate wing to her model, dropped it. The small finished piece hit the concrete floor and skidded directly under Leo's stool. Leo, already tense, shifted his weight to retrieve it, but his foot knocked against a cable bundle, violently pulling the power supply from the main terminal. A high-pitched shriek of protest came from the computer console. The screen went dark. "No!" Leo roared, his control completely dissolving. It was the sound of weeks of effort vanishing, the possibility of ruin rushing back in. Chloe froze, her eyes wide, terrified by the unfamiliar violence in his voice. Maya rushed to her daughter, pulling her close. "Look what you did!" Leo didn't finish the thought, but the implication was catastrophic. He stared at the blank screen, then at the 2 figures huddled by the door. Maya stood up, her face drained of color. "We are leaving, Leo. Right now." She didn't argue, didn't defend Chloe. She just protected her. She grabbed Chloe's hand and pulled her toward the exit. Leo, slumped over his damaged console, barely noticed them leave. He was trying desperately to reboot the system, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had broken the fragile peace. He had broken the promise of safety. Chloe looked back one last time, her lip trembling. "I'm sorry, Mr. Leo." He couldn't answer. He was already too far gone, swallowed by the darkness of his own failure and the crushing weight of having scared the only two people who had looked past his defenses. The silence returned, but this time it was sharp, painful, and absolutely empty. The timer showed 18 hours remaining. Leo spent the next 6 hours in a frantic, desperate attempt to salvage the programming. The power disruption had corrupted the critical firmware. He couldn't rebuild the entire sequence in the time remaining. The CEOs had won, not through force, but through a small, innocent accident catalyzed by his own exhaustion and temper. He finally leaned back, the chill of defeat settling in his bones. The timer showed 12 hours, 14 minutes. The threat was now hollow. He had failed to acquire the infrastructure company, the only way to save the district's aging power distribution system from the impending corporate takeover that would prioritize profit over safety. As he was preparing to dismantle the entire operation, the radio crackled with an urgent news bulletin. The broadcast detailed a sudden, massive utility outage in the north end of the city, hitting the oldest residential zones, precisely the area Maya and Chloe lived. The cause was listed as an overload on a dilapidated junction box. Leo stared at the blinking zero on the screen. The acquisition failed, but the danger he had warned them about, the imminent catastrophic failure of the neglected infrastructure, was already happening. Maya's diner and their small home would be freezing, the refrigerated food spoiling. Chloe would be scared. His original mission, the leverage, the grand challenge, was instantly superseded by a far simpler, more urgent instinct. He wasn't fighting billionaires anymore. He was protecting the only two people who had ever offered him warm meatloaf. He grabbed the modified diagnostic kit he'd been planning to use for the pulse, replaced the high-frequency emitters with stabilizing relays, and pulled on his thickest jacket. He didn't call Maya. He wouldn't risk her telling him to stay away. Driving his beat-up service van toward the northern grid, he bypassed official road closures. He knew the layout of the city's electric artery system better than the utility engineers did. He had reverse-engineered their diagrams months ago. He parked 3 blocks away from the failing substation, the air thick with the smell of ozone and burnt wiring. The official utility crew was standing around, arguing over protocols, unable to access the deep, ancient conduits. Leo didn't ask permission. He located a neglected service entrance behind a discarded dumpster, squeezed through the narrow access point, and dropped 10 feet into the cold, concrete service tunnel. He worked in the damp darkness, his headlamp illuminating the catastrophic failure point. An old relay box melted into slag. He didn't have the official parts, but he had his kit. Working with the speed of desperation, he bypassed the failed junction, rerouting power through a secure, temporary circuit he jury-rigged using industrial-grade components and the same precision that terrified the CEOs. He stabilized the voltage, brought the power back online to the local grid, and then sealed the temporary patch with insulation, ensuring safety for the next 12 hours. He emerged from the tunnel, covered in grime, shivering, his mission complete. The north end lights were flickering back on. He didn't wait for the utility crew to notice. He drove straight back to his garage, collapsing onto his stool just as the sun began to rise. He had failed the challenge, but he had delivered the protection. Leo was staring blankly at the inactive console when he heard the squeak of the bike brakes outside. It was midday, but the atmosphere in the garage was heavy and cold. He hadn't bothered to turn on the lights or the heater. Maya walked in, holding Chloe's hand. They weren't smiling, but their faces were clean of the tension from the day before. The power surge had hit their neighborhood hard, plunging them into the cold for hours until the sudden, inexplicable restoration around dawn. Maya stepped forward, her eyes sweeping over the quiet devastation of his workbench and the defeated slump of his shoulders. She knew instantly that he had lost the big fight. She also knew, without needing a single news report or explanation, who had fixed the North End power grid. Only one person in the district possessed that kind of specific, dangerous skill. The lights came back on at 5:30 a.m., she stated simply, not as a question but as acknowledgement. Leo kept his gaze fixed on the table. Good. It was freezing, Maya continued, her voice soft but firm. Chloe was scared, but when the heat kicked on, she just went back to sleep. You should have told us you were going to fix it. I wasn't fixing it for you, Leo muttered, still unable to look at her, retreating into the practiced defense of his solitude. I was finishing the job, Maya sighed, stepping closer until she was standing just beside the bench. She didn't touch him, but her presence was a physical weight. You were fixing us, Leo. You apologized without speaking. Silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. Chloe, usually so observant, walked toward him. She still clutched the broken model airplane. She didn't mention the console, the shattered connection, or the moment he had yelled. She focused only on the most immediate, tangible truth. Mr. Leo, Chloe whispered, holding out the broken airplane. My wing is the path of most resistance now. It needs you to make it the path of least resistance again. The simple, honest application of his own technical lesson hit Leo with a force that far outweighed the defeat of the corporation. It was an invitation back into their fragile ecosystem, delivered without judgment. He finally looked up. He saw the genuine, unwavering belief in Chloe's eyes and the quiet, accepting strength in Maya's expression. He hadn't protected them from the world. He had simply chosen them over the world. Leo reached out a hand, not to fix the wing yet, but to gently wipe a smudge of dust from Chloe's cheek. He felt the immense vulnerability of the gesture. I can fix it, he said, his voice rough. It will take time. We have time, Maya assured him, taking a deep breath. She didn't need to ask if he was coming back from the edge. He was already there. 6 months later, the garage still smelled of oil, but the atmosphere was fundamentally different. The harsh fluorescent lighting was supplemented by a warm, yellow floor lamp placed near the new, slightly larger kitchen table. The area where the twin bed once sat was now separated by a proper insulated wall containing a small, organized apartment. Leo was using a file to carefully smooth the edges of the tiny airplane wing he had repaired for Chloe. It was painstaking work, requiring patience he didn't know he possessed. He had lost the corporate battle, but the ensuing investigation into the Northern Grid failure had forced the utility company to address the critical infrastructure issues he had identified, quietly vindicating his warnings. Chloe sat at the table, engrossed in a massive, spiral-bound technical manual he had given her, the simplified guide to electronics. Maya was stirring a huge pot on a hot plate, making the smell of beef stew and herbs drift through the workspace, replacing the acrid scent of solder. The utility company had offered Leo a consulting contract to oversee the mandated grid upgrades, a role that required discretion and precision, precisely what he excelled at. He was paid well now, enough to afford insulation, proper heating, and the constant presence of homemade food. Maya placed a steaming bowl in front of him. It wasn't the meatloaf, but it was just as good. She took the seat opposite him, tired but content. The small, rhythmic noises of their evening, the gentle scrape of Chloe's pencil, the low hum of the new heater, the quiet clinking of Leo's file against the plastic, felt less like random activities and more like a carefully calibrated mechanism. The Millers invited us for Thanksgiving, Maya mentioned casually, the family from the corner store. Leo paused, the spoon halfway to his mouth. He thought about loud gatherings, forced small talk, and the requirement to pretend. We can go, Maya said, noticing his hesitation, but we don't have to. We can stay here. Leo looked at Chloe, who was tracing a schematic with profound concentration. He looked at Maya, who was waiting for his decision without pressure. He realized that family wasn't defined by blood or by legal documents, but by the shared, silent choice to keep the lights on for one another. It was the decision to stay anchored in the same small space, regardless of external chaos. He finished his spoonful of stew. It was warm, familiar, and utterly safe. He picked up the tiny airplane wing, placing it carefully on Chloe's shoulder. "We will stay here," Leo stated simply, looking at Maya. "This is where we have the path of least resistance." Maya smiled, a deep, genuine expression that erased the years of fatigue. She reached across the table, not for a romantic gesture, but simply to touch his forearm in quiet affirmation. If this story moved you, please hit the like button, comment below, and let us know what part of Leo's journey resonated with you the most. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more deeply emotional cinematic stories every week.